Hey everybody, it's Norm from Tested.
And it's Jeremy from Tested.
And the time has come, Jeremy. Today we're going to be reviewing the Oculus Touch.
It's been a while. It's good that this is here.
Yeah, after 9 months of playing in VR with the Oculus Rift, but using a gamepad or flight sticks, we finally have motion controllers.
That's right. We finally have sort of parity between the three major VR platforms: PSVR, the HTC Vive, and of course the Oculus Rift.
Now, each of those VR headsets has a tracking solution for the headset, has of course a headset, and also some sort of track motion controller system that gives you hand presence or in-game controllers, but each of them does it a little differently. So today we're going to talk about how the Oculus Touch does it, and here they are right here. So sensing, how these things are tracked. Like the Oculus Rift headset, these touch controllers use outside-in tracking. Basically, we have sensors that look at IR LEDs hidden inside these rings here that let the system know exactly what position they are in volumetric space.
Oculus calls it a constellation tracking system. And you've always, in your Rift, you've had IR LEDs within here that blink at different rates. And you can't see them, of course, but these cameras can. And they have them on the back and the front, and that's how it's used to track them. And these will have the same thing.
Now, you say cameras, Jeremy, and that's because the Oculus Touch comes with a second camera.
That's
with
right.
the Oculus Rift, you get one camera. With Touch, you get a second camera. And the setup we have right now is basically your standard setup of having the two cameras in front of you to the side, looking at you. Setting up Oculus Touch, super simple, I found. There's a whole setup process. I think Oculus has done this right, getting the tutorial and the wizard set up to get you acclimated and to make sure your system configuration is done properly. You get your cameras in place, you put the headset on, and you draw a boundary system.
Yeah, they call the boundary system Guardian. It's similar in setup to the Vive system, which is they call Chaperone. And you basically want to make a border around your play space. And as you create outlines that connect, the system will fill those in. So the easiest way to do that, you taught me actually, is to draw. Is just to paint in your space until you've created, quads that fill in your entire play space.
Right, and this is still 2D space. What you're basically telling the system is what area on the floor you can walk around or move your hands around in. It's not going to take into consideration if you have, lights or C-stands or other things.
That's up to you. When you're setting it up, you don't want to include that in your play space.
Right, but one big difference between the Guardian system on the Oculus setup and the Chaperone system on Steam VR is that with Guardian, you can actually do irregular shapes as in curves and contours to your room as part of the boundary, as opposed to just a rectangle.
That's right. So in Chaperone, with the Vive, if I draw irregular shapes, it will basically create a rectangle, or maybe not a rectangle, but a quad that fits within that space, and that becomes my entire play space. Whereas the space that I draw with the Rift, I then see in VR, if I walk towards the edge of it, it fades in, and I can see that, and it's just as irregular as my drawing was.
Right, and that fade in, you can turn that on or off, or you can have just the outline on the floor. And some games even create their own boundaries based on your play space. So even though you may draw like a big circle or a big irregular shape, Oculus, the software, will determine a rectangle that will be your designated play space, 5 feet by 7 feet, for example, or even like 5 feet by 5 feet. Now, there are two cameras. And so the number one question that we are going to get from people is, how good is the tracking? How does it compare? Is there really parity with the other tracking solutions out there, on the high end being the HTC Vive?
Right.
And I think there are 3 different types of tracking arrangements that Oculus has laid out. There is the most basic one, and most games are designed around this, which is front-facing standing.
Yes, that is going to be when you have one sensor set up facing directly forward, and you have the other one 3 to 6 feet away, facing the exact same direction so that they're parallel, facing towards you, standing in a position that is maybe a foot or 2 away from your desk area.
That surprised me a little bit, that the software recommends that you make them parallel and not crisscross.
Right, I would have thought they would want to converge on a single point, but I guess they're assuming that parallel gives you a wider tracking volume, and they've decided that that's the way to do it.
You want to imagine cones of field of vision coming out of these cameras, and that's what they can see.
As long as you're far enough away from the two cameras, I think that works, because the cones will converge far enough away from you.
Now, there's a little bit of a catch-22 in the placement on the table. Now, I have a very similar standing desk setup at home, and what I found is when I put the cameras in further into the desk, I would get occlusion with the table. And on games where I have to put the controllers down to my waist for holstering, I would lose tracking.
Or Henry or something like that, you actually can sit on the floor, you'd probably lose tracking there too.
Exactly, but if I put the sensors to the edge of the desk, then I would risk being too close to the sensors and then falling outside of the cone field of view. So the best positional setup was actually either putting these sensors at the front of your desk and then playing a few feet away from your desk, or then putting them on tripods and having them a little further back and higher up. So you get that conical field of view.
And you can unscrew the stand. The stand separates about an inch down from the actual camera. You unscrew the base, and then this is a standard tripod screw or mount that you can then thread into a tripod.
Now, this is for standing and front-facing gameplay, and the other two types of tracking arrangements are 360 degrees.
They're both experimental, we should say.
And room scale, absolutely. And 360 just means that you're able to stand in your small play space and spin around, which some games encourage you to do.
I mean, there's going to be some games that will require you to. None that I can think of at launch, but Lone Echo was a great game that we played at Oculus Connect, and that's going to be one that requires you to spin around 360. And that's a game that will require one of these two experimental modes. Maybe they'll be out of experimental phase by the time that comes. But the way to do experimental standing, you can do with simply two cameras. And you put them in opposite corners of your room. Now, it's important to note that one of them will, the one that's sort of on the same plane as your computer, that's going to be fine with the existing cable that comes with the sensor. But for the second camera that's going to go opposite, far away from your computer, you're probably going to need an extension cable for that one.
Yeah, and we tested this with like a $10 5-meter USB 3 extension cable. It worked just fine. Now, having the sensors in the opposite corners of the room, your front-facing, the front of your game is actually going to be diagonally opposite.
Right.
So the sensor is going to be to your left and right.
That gives you the most coverage.
And Oculus recommends having them about 10 feet apart. Now, even at 10 feet apart, this isn't room scale. I'm not walking around.
And Oculus is clear about that. They call this a standing 360 experience.
And even doing a 360 game, spinning around, playing a game like Fantastic Contraption, I didn't notice a lot of occlusion, but there were points where if my back was toward a camera and I was blocking one of the controllers with one hand, or outside of the cone, I would lose tracking. And this isn't real parity, because with the HTC Vive, their tracking system has their beacons on opposite corners of the room.
Well, not only that, you get full room scale with only two.
And you do get full room scale with that. So even with two cameras in basically the same places as your Vive lighthouses, you're not going to get as big a tracking volume.
Yeah, and these are all connected to USB jacks on your computer, which means wires running over there, more USB resources, fewer ports available.
Yep. Now, to get actual room scale with the Oculus Touch setup, you need a third camera. And this is also, like Jeremy mentioned, experimental. So you have to pay an extra $80, get a third camera. That comes with, I think, a USB extension cable. And the arrangement we've seen is basically having two in front of you, as you would for the standing front-facing, and then one behind you. And that offers the best both 360 experience and then also gives you potentially room scale walking around.
That's right. We did see at least two games that connect using this setup. I think most people who really like VR, who want that flexibility, they're going to want to sign up for the third camera, the wiring, having the ports available. It's a bit of a commitment, but that's the kind of experience they're probably going to want.
Yeah, the limitations, I think, with the sensing and the tracking system on the Oculus side are really the conical field of view and the length of the USB cable, and the fact that you actually have to use an additional USB port, just 3 port, for every additional camera. Up to, you can put 4 cameras on this thing. But once you're inside that field of view, precision is totally great.
Oh, I would say it's just every bit as good as the Vive and the Rift has always been.
And range of the field of view of these cameras has been great. Like we did this with our first test with one camera. If you're 12 feet away from a camera, as long as you're in that conical field of view, you're going to get really precise tracking with the touch controllers and the headset.
And the room light has a bit of an effect on PSVR performance. That's more of an optical, system, not as high fidelity as the IR system is here. Room lights, we have stage lights on right now, no problem with tracking.
Yeah, so that's tracking, but of course there's also the actual design of the controllers themselves, and it varies greatly between the three VR systems.
True.
The most popular one, the one that was the gold standard before Oculus Touch, was this guy. This is the HTC Vive. I call it a wand, but you can call it a controller, whatever you want. But this is a pretty versatile controller. You can hold it in a couple different ways and still get great tracking with it. I can hold it like a sword and play Fruit Ninja. I can hold it like a pistol grip and play Space Pirate Trainer. Or I can hold it like I like to call it a phaser, more like a pointing remote, and use it like that. Or like games can use it in novel ways.
Yeah, I played a Grand Canyon rowing game where I actually turned it upside down and was rowing with it.
Right. And the Oculus, it's kind of a little bit of a double-edged sword because there's versatility in the ways you can hold it, but because you can hold it in more ways, the game doesn't know as much about how you're holding it, where your actually hands are.
That's right. Developers can't count on that. Whereas with the Oculus Touch controllers, it fits so well contoured into your hand. There's really only one way that you're going to hold this thing. And I mean, not only that, one is made for your left hand and one is made for your right hand. The developers know how this is going to be oriented. So pistols you shouldn't have to worry too much about getting an odd tilt. All of the virtual devices that this turns into in VR should be in the right orientation.
And I think Oculus designed this for hand presence, to get virtual hands in the virtual space. And in all their tutorials and demos, they really show those glowing blue hands prominently. And a lot of that is benefited by the fact that you have these capacitive sensors in addition to buttons on the controller. So buttons first, you have a trigger button, analog trigger. You have a grip button on the side for your middle finger.
Also analog.
Also analog. And then on top, you have a thumbstick, which works as a button, and two buttons, and I guess a menu button, and a spot that works as a capacitive sensor as well. But each of the buttons on top here are capacitive.
Every single thing on the top here, even the analog stick, is a capacitive sensor. So that if I'm in VR and I very lightly touch one of these buttons and the interface, respects this or supports this, my thumb will touch that. And if I let go, the thumb will go up. So this doesn't necessarily sense where my fingers are in 3D space, but it does allow me to do simple gestures like pointing. If I take my finger off of the analog stick, it will point forward. If I lift my thumb up, I'll give a thumbs up. So I think for social, this could actually be pretty great.
Absolutely. There is no capacitive sensor on the grip button, so you can squeeze it, and in some games, in some situations, it'll make a fist, but you can't, for example, do a high five while holding the Oculus Touch controller.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. This is the first controller that I have ever really wanted to wear this strap on.
That's right.
Because with the Wiimote and with the Vive, I feel pretty confident I'm not going to throw or drop the thing, although famously a lot of people have. This, I don't know if it's because my hands are in a grip formation and I'm constantly throwing things in various games. I feel like there's a strong chance that I actually will throw this straight into my TV. So I feel much more comfortable wearing the wrist straps with these.
I think there's two reasons for that. I think one, because even though you're holding it, I'm never really gripping it that hard. It almost rests on my fingers as opposed to having to hold it and grip it like some type of stick. And two, because of the strong sense of hand presence, you don't see the touch controller in a lot of the experiences. I forget that it's there. I just think that I'm pointing and making fists and giving thumbs up. And so, I have the wrist strap on just in case it falls off my hand. I'm holding it pretty loosely. It's a very lightweight controller. I also like the ability to let go of the controller, go to my keyboard, type, and then flip the controller back up and have it in my hand.
I think the fact that I feel like I might throw it is testament to the immersion level that this provides.
Yeah, and of course it could be a little better. I would love for it to actually stay in place and I'm not gripping it at all, but maybe that's for the future, as we've seen with some of those prototypes on the HTC Vive side. You did mention that they are asymmetrical, which is an important thing. With the Vive controllers, you could just pick up any of them and not have any problem.
And then whichever one you had in your left hand would adopt the left-hand functionality. With these, you actually have to pick up the left-handed one and put the right-handed in the other one. And the only problem that I've run into that is that if I have the headset on already, I can't tell. I've been spending a few days with these. I still can't tell just by looking at them which is left and which is right immediately. So I'll reach out with my headset on, I'll see them in VR, and then I'll have the wrong ones, and I'll try to fumble to get them flipped around. That's the only issue. I wouldn't say that it's a deal breaker. It's just something to consider. Maybe take a really good look, learn how to learn how to discern which is left and right, maybe store them on your desk in a way that's easy to pick up. You'll know which is left and which is right.
Yeah, and there is no real elegant way to store it on your desk. If you have it like this, which is what I want to store it as, it just kind of rolls over.
Yeah.
So I put them face down, which then makes it easy to grab like that. And like I said, they're pretty lightweight. We have medium-sized hands, and they nest really comfortably in our hands. We put it in the hands of people with larger hands and smaller hands, and it was still contoured to fit their hands pretty well. There's also a battery in here.
It's interesting. It's the only VR device that actually requires you to replace the batteries ever.
That's right.
Everything else is rechargeable.
Right, and so it comes with AA batteries, one AA battery for each. They've lasted for a long time. We've been playing it all week, and we're still 3 bars out of 3 bars in the UI when we check the battery. And you can easily replace the battery by removing the cover, and then there's a nice magnetic seal for that to snap that back in place.
I think you're probably going to want to invest in a couple of rechargeable AA batteries, though, just for the sake of not having to buy new batteries every week that you actually use this thing.
So that's the hardware with Oculus Touch, but there is a large launch lineup of games. Content's the most important thing.
True that. Thank you, Oculus, for giving us a ton of bundles with this thing. I mean, we get at least 3 games at launch for free. You get Dead and Buried, you get
VR Sports,
and Medium.
You get Medium, Quill,
and also The Unspoken.
The Unspoken. And then in the future, they also announced Robo Recall.
Coming next year.
Will be free as well. But I want to split content into basically 3 categories as well. Okay. There's cross-platform content. Developers who have been working in VR on the other platforms with motion controllers for the past year and now have ported their content over to Oculus Touch. How does that play?
You know, what's amazing is that a lot of that is already on Steam, and it just works. I played Space Pirate Trainer and Job Simulator on Steam, and the game seemed to think that I had a Vive controller, but everything worked flawlessly. I was very impressed with that. So when I loaded up Space Pirate Trainer, I believe that was it, when I got into there, you can see a Vive controller where your touch is. So it's very interesting. It's almost like you now have a Vive, because in VR you apparently do. But the way that the analog works between the 2 devices was, I think, genius. So completely different interfaces. The Touch has the same number of buttons, but it has an analog stick instead of a touchpad. And the way that this works is, when I'm in the game, I see in VR the Vive controller. If I move the analog stick around, I see a little phantom dot move around on the touch controller. And if I press the stick, then that's pressing the actual touch controller. And these 2 buttons are mapped to the 2 buttons
the top and
there.
down menu and home buttons are mapped to your 2 buttons.
That's
Because
right.
there's technically more buttons on the touch controller than there are on the HTC Vive controller.
Plus the capacitive aspect. But they really needed that capacitive aspect too, because when I just touch touch the analog stick, that's when the little dot shows up. It has nothing to do with moving it. Very smart.
Right, and then I also played a bunch of games that exist on other VR platforms in the Oculus Store, because those developers have ported them over. So playing a game like Space Pirate Trainer works perfectly well in Oculus Home. And what I found is, initially I was a little less accurate using the touch controllers, and maybe it's the way I'm holding the controller is a little different than the way I would typically hold the Vive controller, even though the angle where you grip it is essentially the same. And then there are games like Fantastic Contraption and Job Simulator, which are really designed for room scale. And on the Oculus Home platform, both those games have modes to play them standing and front-facing forward.
Okay, but is that mode any different than the smallest scale version on the Vive platform?
No, it's exactly what they've already put into the Vive platform. Because obviously some people who have Vives will only play standing front-facing only. And then the third type of content is Oculus exclusive content, things that they've made to really take advantage of the design and tracking of the touch controllers. There's The Unspoken, and you played some of that in multiplayer.
I think it's fantastic. Yeah, unfortunately, there's not enough out there for there to be multiplayer access all the time. But they did have an event last week, and I was able to jump in there and play a couple matches. I won 2, I lost 1. I think that is the standout finesse game. It has the most subtlety in terms of the amount of skill required to play. That's going to be one that ramps up and you want to go back to. It's great. I mean, we've talked about it before. It's a magic game where you're basically one-on-one, and you're casting spells, and you're putting up shields, and you're using resources to cast larger scale scale spells. It's a lot of fun. It's the learning curve is probably the steepest of all the games that are out there. The other one is VR Sports.
Both those games take advantage of gestures and hand presence to some extent.
Sure.
The idea that you're not holding any type of controller in the virtual world, you're just moving your hands around, whether dribbling a basketball or putting your hand up to cast a shield or throw a fireball.
That's right, yeah. So the object that becomes your controller is a hand, and this controller lends itself very well to that.
Yeah, I did also play Robo Recall and Dead and Buried, games that have you hold pistols. And I think Dead and Buried did a fantastic job of it. It's one of those things where if you're wearing the headset and you see the virtual gun in the headset while peeking out and seeing the grip, how you're holding the controller in the real world, it's perfectly lined up. Obviously, it's a first-party game. They designed that perfectly, but the guns felt super, super natural.
I agree. The angle that they got those pistols at works really well.
Yeah, I think they spent a lot of time working on exactly what that angle, what that contour would be.
That's a heavily multiplayer game, so that's another game, unfortunately, we haven't had a ton of chance to play with other people yet. But I'm looking forward to that. That's a game that has voice support built into it, I believe, and that just comes right out of the headset. I think that'll be a lot of fun.
And then there are a bunch of non-game exclusive content that Oculus has made, including Toy Box, Medium, and Quill. Now, Toy Box, I know a lot of people were excited about it. It ended up being more just of a tech demo.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Toy Box I was hoping would be something even akin to like the Lab from Valve, but it really is 3 different rooms where you can jump in, you can throw some shapes around, light off some fireworks, control a little radio-controlled tank. Not something you're going to be going to very often, but I could understand if it was helpful for them to develop and test out with.
It seemed to be a thing they made to give 15 to 20 minute demos for people new to Oculus Touch, like they did at E3 2 years ago when we first got hands-on with the Touch.
You know, one thing we didn't mention about the setup process is the cool like 1980s robot scene that you actually use when you're setting them up for the first time. It gives you a chance to explore and interact with objects. And it's almost like an evolved version of the Toy Box. I think that they did a good job with that.
Yeah, but the actual content creation tools, Medium and Quill, I think are fantastic. Now,
absolutely.
On the Vive side, we had Tilt Brush, which was painting in a virtual space. And the equivalent, the analog for Tilt Brush on Touch isn't Medium, it's Quill.
Right.
And Quill is just, it's like Photoshop in VR.
Well, yeah, you might also be saying that because the interface is very technical. You know, it looks like an old school Photoshop interface. There's nothing cutesy or VR or anything about it. It's even to that extent, they're probably going to expand it and prettify it a little bit. But it is very, very powerful, and it's really well done. As you draw within that space, the sounds that they even incorporated into that app make me feel so immersed into that space, and I was highly, highly impressed by it. The drawings that you can load in that other people have done with it,
oh my goodness,
they really show off what's capable. And they've got all the features that Tilt Brush has added over time, such as scaling and moving the world around. And it's highly, highly impressive. I look forward to seeing more of the professional work done in that app.
And exploring those other drawings, I found myself less walking around and more scaling the drawings around me and pulling them toward me. There's one particular demo where it's a drawing of 2 aliens in a car. One's holding like a snow globe, and as you expand and blow up their world, you can go inside the snow globe and you see another scene in there, and you go inside another scene and deeper, and it just plays with the idea of scale so well. Whereas I believe on Tilt Brush, initially, it was more about just that room, walking around the room, the canvas being your one-to-one room.
What sets Quill apart from Medium is this idea of volumetric drawing. So Quill, you're still drawing like Tilt Brush in 2 dimensions, everything. Well, you're drawing in 3 dimensions, but the thing that goes into space is 2-dimensional. It's basically paint. But in Medium, you're sculpting in 3D, you're basically sculpting 3D objects with blobs, and you expand things and stretch things and cut into things. And that's more akin to sculpting. And it's really cool that they're doing that, because like we don't have anything like that on the Vive yet.
And my concern with those tools is, would they be novel tools, or would they actually be robust tools that professionals can use? And it seems like for both Quill and Medium, there are export abilities and lots of nitty-gritty tools that I would not know how to use, but professionals could take advantage of. I've been following a lot of sculptors who have been using Oculus Touch, and they've been putting out some amazing work, and we're going to hopefully showcase some of that on the site
It's
as well.
super cool. Yeah, you can export cube maps so that people can share. You can share these things, export animations. I think you can even export models, so you can bring them into 3D modeling platforms. It's super cool. It seems like a whole new realm for artists to experiment with.
Obviously, since Touch has come out, I've played so little of pure gamepad games on the Rift. And speaking of gamepad, there is some type of gamepad parity with the touch controllers.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the touch controllers, if you look at them, you got a couple analog sticks, you got 4 buttons, so it kind of maps. And Oculus has part of their SDK. There's this compatibility aspect to it, so that I loaded up Lucky's Tale with the touch controllers just to see how it works. And I moved around with the left stick and I jumped with the right stick. But so on the right stick I have A and B, and on my left hand I have X and Y, just like an Xbox gamepad if you put them right next to each other. But there is a problem because sometimes you want to hit X and Y while running. And I'm using the left analog stick to run. I can't hit those buttons while I'm running.
With your right hand.
With my left hand.
With left hand, yeah.
Yeah, and so I mean, I can understand why that is because they're emulating an Xbox gamepad. But there's going to be some games that were made for gamepad, and even though that the compatibility exists on the touch, you're still going to want to use a gamepad.
Yeah, and there is no way to attach tracking to those gamepads. That Oculus Touch actually comes with this clamp that lets you connect the touch controllers to the guitar or the Rock Band accessory, but there's no way to attach this to a gamepad, so you would have gamepads tracked like PSVR having the DualShock controller tracked in-game.
I mean, that's an interesting idea. I wouldn't be surprised if eventually we get some sort of tracked gamepad. I mean, that's one thing that the PSVR has against everyone else is their gamepad is tracked in virtual reality.
Yeah. So we talked about the content, we talked about the hardware, but really as a purchasing decision, Oculus Touch is a no-brainer for anyone who has an Oculus Rift.
No, in a sense, I mean, this is something that we've been saying all year long. I mean, we've been saying we can't wait for Touch to be out so that we have this kind of parity. Anyone who bought an Oculus Rift, the gamepad games are great. And I mean, I think Oculus has had a lot of success with that this year. But if you haven't tried this yet, this is just a whole new level of immersion that people on Vive and even to some extent PSVR has been experiencing this year.
So the real purchasing decision really is if you're a current Oculus owner is whether to buy the third camera or not.
Yeah.
And while the third camera is going to improve your tracking, field of view, and give you potential experimental room scale tracking, I think right now you don't need it for the vast majority of content out in the Oculus Store.
No, I would absolutely agree with that. Just be prepared to be in a standing position facing forward. Even Robo Recall, which is a game that's not even coming out until next year, which will be free, it allows you to control which direction you're going to face once you teleport. So they're already working in ways around this limitation.
And for people who haven't adopted either the Vive or PSVR or the Oculus Rift, what should we recommend? I mean, I think as an owner of all three systems, since having Touch, the one I'm gravitating most toward is Touch.
Well, me too. The touch controllers are great. I would probably say that they're superior to the Vive controller. The headset, I've said, is superior already.
In terms of comfort.
It's lighter. The headphone aspect is just, it's hard to explain how much nicer that is just to have headphones built into it. The one downside is you need USB resources. You need the cables all running to your computer. You need more than 2 sensors if you want to do room scale. So this is the downside. Like I do not like this aspect more than the Vive, lighthouses. I think those are superior. But the takeaway experience, yes, on balance, I would say the Rift is a stronger one.
And if you look at the spectrum of VR content available right now, yes, the Vive came out with track controllers almost a year ahead of Oculus Touch, but there haven't been this whole library of room scale dedicated games that require perfect room scale that would compel me to buy the Vive over this. If you look at the Steam VR library, you can play the vast majority of those VR games with Oculus Touch just as well.
The wall that people ran into very quickly with room scale was the limitations of even the widest room scale. People want to walk beyond those walls, and so we ended up with teleporting games anyway, which you can play standing in one spot. So you have a few handful of games like Job Simulator that really do take advantage of a large volume. but those are very small. And I think the number of people who are going to be capable of playing those is going to remain a small percentage of this genre of gaming, that it's not going to be an incentive. There's no real incentive for developers to develop for those kind of spaces. So
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. So that's the Oculus Touch. It is out now, December 6th, and we'll be playing more of these games and telling you more about them on our site. Thank you, Jeremy, for testing and reviewing them with me, and we'll see you next time. Bye.